How little people feel about themselves, tomorrow at 9.
The First Estate, Religion in Review, with Dr. Russell Barber.
Today on The First Estate, we'll look at the role the black church is playing in the political scene, examine the problem of Jewish teenage suicide, and discuss the newly issued Vatican sexual guidelines. Let's begin with blacks and politics. Black Americans generally view the Reagan administration as backing away from strong federal support of programs that benefit minorities. When the Reverend Jesse Jackson became a Democratic candidate for president, he welcomed black churches across the country that vowed their support of the Jackson as the quickest way in which to improve the black condition in this country. It was no accident then when Jesse Jackson went to Syria successfully to negotiate the release of U.S. Navy flyer Lieutenant Robert Goodman, that he took along a negotiating team that included leading black clergy. Here to discuss the emerging role of blacks in the American political scene is Dr. Carl Flemister, Executive Minister of the American Baptist Churches of Metropolitan New York. Thanks very much for coming, Carl.
Glad to be here.
Good to have you back on the First Estate. You know, you're a Baptist, but there's something called the National Baptist Convention USA, which is evidently a collection of the largest American black Baptist churches in the country. And recently, they pledged their support of more than 30,000 churches, and they say 7 million members, to raise funds and support the candidacy of the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Why do you think that black church is getting so deeply involved in the Jackson candidacy?
Well, first of all, the church has always been involved in politics. The exodus from Egypt was a political move. But the black church traditionally has used its collective influence to make some gains and to get some things that were being denied it by the rest of society. It's the only place where blacks have some collective energy and collective strength. And so it's only natural that the black church would begin to use that strength to influence the political scene.
Well, since it's so appropriate, and since there's been such a long history of black churches involving themselves in the political scene, does that account for the reason that black preachers seem to have such influence over their congregations?
Well, the black preacher has always had a great deal of influence. The black preacher is both priest and prophet, is in a sense the engineer who sits in the front of the train, who has the whole panoramic view of the landscape, political, social, economic, and therefore is in the best position to provide the congregation with some leadership in moving it on to where it needs to be and where it wants to be.
But how far can the church go in supporting a political campaign without losing its Internal Revenue Service tax exemption?
Well, Russ, you know, I look upon the black church's involvement, or any church's involvement, but particularly the black church's involvement in the political situation as an educational effort on the part of the black church. And the IRS certainly doesn't prohibit spending money to educate people. This country has left black people out of the mainstream for such a long time that I think they need to be educated to the fact that there is some collective strength there, and that this particular group of people deserves a hearing on the political scene.
Do you think that there's any justification for a black preacher to get up before his congregation and literally support the candidacy of a particular candidate, as opposed to discussing the issues and suggesting that the congregation should decide who might best satisfy their personal needs regarding that issue?
I think someday that might be the way it ought to be done, but at the present time, I think some extraordinary kinds of moves are called for. And I think if well, let's face it, a good many people, because of their struggle for survival in the daily marketplace, do not acquaint themselves with the facts and are not able to make informed decisions. Therefore, I think the pastor has to be the basis for the information that enables people to make decisions. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the pastor saying how he or she feels and what conclusions they have come to with respect to political decisions.
I know we shouldn't generalize, Carl, but is it fair to say that by and large, as we suggested in the introduction, that the black community in this country is no longer supportive of the Reagan administration because of the various cutbacks and Reaganomics, as it's called, that have happened?
You're absolutely correct. And it is not only the cutbacks. This is not just an economic, these are not just economic considerations that blacks are making, but I think it's the whole pullback of the civil rights gains that have been made. These all seem to be reversed by this administration. I think that it's the taking away of opportunities that people have had in the past to improve their economic and social lot. It's a whole host of things that this administration has taken away.
Okay, now enter suddenly on the scene, not so suddenly, he's been around for a while, but in a presidential mode, our friend Reverend Jesse Jackson. Mm-hmm. I know that you were contacted by him to go to Syria and were unable to do so when he went there to collect, to start the negotiations to bring back Lieutenant Goodman. And we've got some footage, actually, of some of that has occurred. Now, we're going to show that in a minute. But we understand that he was there on a humanitarian mission. But wasn't there a possibility that it was more than that there were politics involved?
Well, I can't really answer that because I don't know what the underlying reason was. It certainly was a humanitarian mission. And for those skeptics who may not believe that, I would say that if it was political, or if there was a political element to it, so be it. It is certainly no different than the President of the United States having a soldier stationed up in the balcony while he made the State of the Union address.
Here's Lieutenant Goodman saying something about his return.
That's awesome, and that shows what kind of country this is. I thought daily about the POW experience that I had been trained to withstand, and the type of POW experience the guys had experienced in Vietnam. I would like to take from that experience and say one quote that a gentleman said when he came back from Vietnam, and that's "God bless America." Thanks a lot.
God bless America. Well, that's the whole concept here, isn't it? Blacks see this approach of getting involved in politics and pushing for things that are important to the black community as being an aspect of their God-given right in this country.
Absolutely. I just want to say this about Jesse Jackson going to Syria, that he is involved in a political campaign, and while I believe with all my heart that he went for humanitarian reasons, if there was some political gain to be made from this, he has every right to exploit that. There's no reason why he should change the rules in terms of how one aspires to the office of presidency in this country.
Registration is a major problem. We saw that by 1982, some 7.2 million blacks were still unregistered out of the 17 million plus that are eligible to vote. What's being done to encourage them to register?
Some of the most extraordinary efforts that I've ever seen. Voter registration drives are being conducted in just about wherever people are. Where blacks are graduating from high school while they're standing in line waiting to process and to receive their diplomas. There are people going up and down with voter registration forms. There are people in the waiting rooms of clinics, welfare department, outside of shopping centers. Wherever black people are, there are voter registration drives taking place. And I think this is going to close the gap in terms of the numbers of blacks who will be registered for this next election.
One last quick question. Are you supporting Jesse Jackson?
I am not supporting any candidate. Personally, I will make my decision with respect to whom I support at some time in the future.
And what about the American Baptist churches? Do they have a position on it?
The American Baptist Churches traditionally does not support candidates, and that's why it's difficult for me to say publicly where I am on this.
Carl, thank you very much for coming. I know you've just gotten back from Nicaragua, and we'd like to chat with you sometime about that trip. Perhaps we can have you back. Our time is up now. And I also want to thank you for stepping in for Dr. Thelma Adair, who is going to be with us as well, and she fell ill, and we hope she recovers soon.
Happy to do it for you and for her.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Pleasure.
Good.
There is no clear law prohibiting suicide in the Bible or the Talmud. The Bible mentions only 2 suicides, King Saul and David's counselor Ahithophel, and the first clear-cut statement about the crime of suicide comes from the post-Talmudic booklet Semachot, where it states that people who kill themselves are to receive no burial rites. Throughout history, however, there have been suicides, and a frightening modern-day phenomenon is teenage suicide. Each year, 6,500 young people end their own lives. 10 times that number attempt suicide but fail. Because of this growing problem, Keeping Posted, a publication of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, devoted a recent issue to teenage suicide. Here to discuss the problem is one of the contributing authors to that edition, Rabbi Allen S. Kaplan, director of the Fund for Reform Judaism at the Union, and a good friend of mine. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you, Russ. Good to be here with you.
Why is teenage suicide such a significant problem? What's causing these kids to consider ending their life before really it's ever started?
Well, Russ, children are under a tremendous amount of pressure, perhaps a little more today because of the intensity of the competition for jobs and the intensity of the competition for places in schools, and because of the complex nature of the world in which we live. But also it's because we have a problem in the deterioration of the family's falling apart, and the children losing their support systems.
Your article spoke directly to that. Why do families fail? Why do they fail? What's happening to the family?
Families are caught up in themselves. Oftentimes, each individual member is tied into him or her own personal being and problems. We're still suffering from the me generation, me, me, me. And we don't think about what happens to us. And so as families work together, they really don't work together. They're working against each other, each person working for his or her own problem and his or her own feelings.
This is going to be probably an impossible question, but who are the potential suicides? What are the danger signals we should watch for?
Well, the danger signals, first of all, is depression. A depressed youngster, young adult, is a person who is a prime candidate for suicide. Now, I don't mean, ordinary depression, I'm blue today, it's Blue Monday, but someone who's really depressed, someone who's undergoing a great deal of turmoil in his or her own inner life, problems at school, social problems, breaking up with one's girlfriend or one's boyfriend. All these are things that press down upon a youngster, and when a youngster says, I really don't feel it's worth it anymore, that youngster is giving you a clear sign that he or she is thinking about ending it all.
Is this a growing problem in the Jewish community? We usually think of Jewish families as having a very strong base, a very strong support system, and that the kids would come from, are more likely not to have these kinds of problems.
Russ, today it's a problem across religious and racial barriers. It is a problem that seriously affects all of us, in that even the Jewish family suffers from the breakdown of the family. The nuclear family, the famous nuclear family, has deteriorated. The rising incidence of divorce and separation has literally devastated the Jewish community as well as it has other communities. And this is a prime cause for the increase in the number of children who are Jewish, who are among that 6,500, we think only 6,500, perhaps even more, who actually do commit suicide.
You mentioned divorce. There is a direct relationship, isn't there, between divorce rate and the suicide rate?
Absolutely. In a family that is in the process of disintegrating, where the marriage is going to end with a divorce, often the child becomes a pawn in the battle that goes on between the mother and the father. And the child reacts to that. Children also have a peculiar sense of thinking. They identify themselves, maybe I'm the cause for mommy and daddy's problems. Maybe it's me. I'm the center of attention. They yell at me, or I don't do this or this, and the whole interaction between families. And so the child thinks, well, I'll solve their problem. I want mommy and daddy to remain married. I'll solve their problem. I will disappear. And by disappearing, they end their lives.
With everyone being aware that this problem is growing, why is it still such a taboo subject in synagogues and schools and families?
We don't want to acknowledge it. Denial of the reality of the problem is something which all of us tend to do. That's how we deny, for example, in a family where there's alcoholism, which is a contributing factor to teenage suicide. It's common for parents to deny the problem. It just doesn't exist. Children. So we always are denying the problem. We don't want, if we ignore it, maybe it will go under the carpet and disappear.
One of the things I found very interesting in the Keeping Posted thing that you folks published were 13 myths concerning suicide, things that we all think would apply but evidently don't. Identify